Full name is William Jackson Butt II. My entire life I've gone by Jack. I was born in Fayetteville on April 23rd, 1950 in the City Hospital, which is, as we speak, being raised and constructed into a new addition to the library. Well, my parents were Thomas F. Butt and Cecilia King Butt. Thomas F. Butt was born and reared in Eureka Springs, Carroll County, and Cecilia was born and reared in eastern Arkansas, Searcy and Batesville, and they met at the University of Arkansas back right at the beginning of World War II and were married.
Tell me about, I understand your family has a long tradition in the legal business and some in the medical business, but tell me about your family tradition in the...
Well, my family tradition as it pertains to law, I guess, started with my grandfather, Festus Orestes, or F.O. Butt, who became a lawyer in 1998 in Carroll County. Back then, most lawyers, at least in Arkansas, didn't go to law school. They read law with a local lawyer until that lawyer certified to the local judge. They thought that that person was smart enough or good enough to be a lawyer, and then the local judge would interview him and admit him to the bar. So my grandfather, Festus Orestes, was actually admitted to the bar at age 21 and practiced until he was 95 years old in Carroll County, Arkansas. He had 7 children, 2 daughters and 5 sons. 4 of the sons became lawyers. My father, of course, was a judge here in Washington County and actually was on the bench for 50 years, which we think was a record in Arkansas for the longest serving judge by the time he retired. He was the youngest of the 7 children. His older brother Bob was a prominent lawyer in Rogers, Arkansas for many years. I think Bob died in 1959. His brother Joe practiced law in Ohio. I don't remember Joe's death. It was in the 70s. He had a brother, the oldest brother, John, was actually the prosecutor for this circuit for many years and ultimately a circuit judge in this circuit until he died in a car vehicle accident in 1950. And then my father had a brother who was a doctor, William Jackson Butt, I guess the first, and he was a physician practicing here in Fayetteville for many years. He actually delivered my 2 older brothers and me without a fee. So his fee was that I became his namesake. I'm William Jackson Butt II.
And you're the second because?
Well, my uncle Jack was William Jackson Butt I. And so I'm not a junior. That would be if my father's name was William Jackson. I'm a second. But I have, out of the descendants of F.O. Butt, I think there's 7 or 8 other lawyers that are cousins of mine who practice all over the United States. And my daughter is also a lawyer, so she would be 4th generation, and there are among those cousins other 4th generation lawyers from F.O. Butt. So it's kind of a lawyering family over the last 110 years.
Do you have any stories on your grandpa you can tell that you remember?
I've got lots of stories on my grandpa. Because he didn't die till he was 97, I was 22 at his death. So I knew him, even though I was the youngest son of his youngest son, I knew him pretty well. And he was a great storyteller, and he could talk for hours about clients and cases and the law and the drama that arises from that. And in fact, one time when my daughter, who never knew her great-grandfather, was about 12 or 13, she has a practically photographic memory. I took her over to meet Lewis Epley, who is now a retired, formerly prominent lawyer in Carroll County, who was kind of brought on. My grandfather was his mentor to some degree. And we spent about 2 hours at lunch over there, and Lewis spun yarns of my grandfather for my daughter so that oral history would be passed on, and they were great stories. And I'm trying to remember any of them. My grandfather was very, very thrifty. He lived very comfortably, but he died a wealthy man because he almost spent nothing. But Lewis Epley said he walked in one time, and my grandfather was sitting at his desk with his feet propped up, and he was chipping off flecks of something on his shoes. And he said, "Lewis," he said, "I thought I could save money on shoe polish by shellacking my shoes so I never have to polish them again. He said, but this damn shellac doesn't take, it's breaking off after about a week. There are some other longer, more involved legal stories. I'd have to look back at my notes to remember all the details.
Tell me about growing up. Where did you go to school, and what was it like growing up here?
Well, I grew up, I was actually born when my parents lived in a little house on Connor Street, which is back behind the county courthouse. Most people in Fayetteville don't know it. It's a one-block street with, I think, 5 houses on it. But before I was 1 year old, we moved to West Davidson Street, which is adjacent to what I called growing up the City Park. It's now called Wilson Park. And I grew up all 18 years there in Wilson Park neighborhood, went to Washington Elementary School, Woodland Junior High School, Fayetteville High School, and grew up. Fayetteville was a smaller, simpler town then.
At what age were you when your dad became a judge and a lawyer? Was he a lawyer?
Well, the vacancy on the bench of my uncle created an opening, and my father didn't immediately succeed him, but I think my father was elected to his first term in 1950, which is the year I was born. So I always knew him as a judge in terms of what he did. And he served on the bench for 50 years and was stricken with lung cancer when he was 83 years old and retired and died about 2 months later. I guess I was 53 at the time of his death. No, I was 50 at the time of his death, and he died in 2000. So his whole professional life, I knew him as a judge, and in terms of things being simpler then, if my mother was busy or tired of us at home, Daddy would take one or more of us to work with him when we were smaller. And whether we rode the circuit to the Benton County Courthouse or the Carroll County Courthouse, actually there were 2, one in Eureka Springs and one in Berryville, or to the Madison County Courthouse or to the Washington County Courthouse in Fayetteville, Daddy would bring us along. And after we got tired of playing with the pencils and the erasers and the staplers in his drawer, we just have the run of the courthouse and walk down to the jail and look at the prisoners and the county clerks and the jailers and the sheriffs and the people that hang around the courthouse all kind of knew we were Judge Butt's boys, and so they indulged us and to some degree spoiled us, and we just kind of grew up in and around the courthouse, not all the time, but that was a comfortable place for us. And back then, I mean, I can't imagine bringing my kids to work and setting them loose in the courthouse for a day, but those were simpler times.
Talk about the Washington County Courthouse. What are your earliest memories of going in, and who did you talk to when you went in?
Well, I mean, I would have been 3, 4, 5 years old. I don't remember the names, but the circuit clerks and county clerk, the sheriff, the bailiffs, I mean, whoever we saw hanging around, they'd say, "Who do you belong to?" And we go, "Well, Judge Butt's my daddy." "Oh, you belong to Judge Butt." So there'd be a little banter back and forth, and they'd give us a lollipop or ask if we wanted to draw on their pad, or if they were busy, shoo us away. But at one time or another, I think I ran into all the sheriffs and clerks over there from about 1956 through the present.
Talk about the ones that you remember when you first started practicing law. Who was working in the courthouse, and what were they like?
Well, Alma Colmeyer was a circuit clerk, and Alma was very pleasant, very professional. As far as I knew, she was an excellent clerk. She did a good job and was very helpful and had a well-trained staff. And Marilyn was the same way with the county clerk, which did the probate filings. And she was very competent and exacting, took good care of the records, knew the procedures, was very helpful to the young lawyers finding their way around, and had a well-trained staff. And both of them were there for a long time. I've been practicing law myself here since 1981. What's that? 38 years, and we've been through several clerks. I probably don't know the ones after them as well as I knew them, because I kind of cut my teeth on them. And both Alma and Marilyn were in office for a long time, and they deserved to be. They ran for election each year and rarely drew opposition.
Talk about some of the prosecutors you remember over the years, going back maybe to at least Judge Gibson.
Well, when I moved back here in 1981, I had practiced law elsewhere for 6 years after law school and was away from Fayetteville for 13 years. But when I moved back here in 1981, Judge Gibson was actually on the bench and Kim Smith was the prosecutor. And that had been a fairly recent change, so people would still talk about Judge Gibson and his duties as a prosecutor, and he was very, very highly regarded as a prosecutor, according to the lawyers I talked to. He was also very, very highly regarded as a judge. I actually, in trying to move back here, interviewed with Kim Smith, who's a year older than I am, but to see if I could get a job. I was looking for a job, any kind of job at all I could get as a lawyer to move back to Fayetteville. And I interviewed with Kim Smith, and at the time I didn't know him from Adam. We've since become very close friends, but he simply didn't have a place on his staff for me, and we both will remember from time to time when I interviewed and both say, gee whiz, I wonder what my career would have looked like if you had hired me. But he didn't, and I took a different path. I actually have done very little criminal law since moving back to Fayetteville, and so I will work a traffic ticket now and again, but usually that's on the municipal court level, district court level, and I have known the prosecutors primarily just socially because I met them in the Bar Association or I knew them outside of being a lawyer, like Kim Smith and I have been fishing together and played golf together, but I have not been a criminal defense lawyer that would cause me to professionally interface with Kim Smith or his successors in the office. But Kim Smith was very highly regarded as a prosecutor. He went on to become a circuit judge, and like Judge Gibson, he was very highly regarded as a circuit judge. He was very practical, understood the law, understood evidence, managed his court well, could keep things going and in hand without being offensive or brusque, and I was very sad to see him leave the bench. He was an excellent judge.
Talk about some of the other judges you remember, maybe Lineberger, others.
Well, when I moved back here, there were two chancellors. That system has changed, but the chancellors basically handled divorces and non-jury trials, land disputes, adoptions, guardianships, things that weren't about money damages or criminal sanctions. And those chancellors were my father and Judge Lineberger. For obvious reasons, I couldn't practice in front of my father. I would take him now and again in uncontested probate or divorce where there was no chance of any prejudice because everybody agreed on everything. But I did all of my chancery work in front of Judge Lineberger. The circuit judges at that time were Malin Gibson and Paul Jameson, both of whom had been recently elected, I think, when I moved back here in 1981, though they were experienced middle-aged lawyers at the time. So I practiced quite a bit before Judge Lineberger, and Judge Lineberger was very smart. He was very quick on the take to understand cases. He didn't have much patience for fools. If things were, time was being wasted or lawyers were going off and on in the direction of his courtroom, he was pretty prompt to get you back online. It was said of him, and all the lawyers kind of chuckle, that you make your case and it's usually decided in front of Judge Lineberger in about 5 minutes in his office, because before each trial he would call the lawyers in, and of course he had very carefully read all the pleadings, he knew the background, knew what it was about, and he would say, well boys, what's going on here? Or lawyers, I mean, lady lawyers were over there too, what's going on in this case? And I learned very quickly you had about 4 minutes to make your most compelling opening argument. The other side would make its little statement, and then there'd be some back and forth, and he'd ask a couple of questions. At that point, most lawyers, most judges will say, okay, let's go out and try the case. But Judge Lineberger would say, you know, it looks to me like you've got a pretty weak case on the causation here, and getting alimony is not probably going to happen. Do you guys think you can settle this case? So he kind of gave his preview of how he was going to rule based upon our 5-minute opening statements. And 9 times out of 10, that's how it played out in court. So we learned that, and you go out and tell your client, I know you wanted $1,000 a month alimony, but the judge is not inclined to give you much alimony. Let's see if we can't settle it for less than that instead of spending all day in court and maybe getting slammed by the judge. That could have been a very good thing. It was kind of an early method of mediation with a little compulsion there from the judge. Some people kind of resented it because they thought he prejudged the case when he hadn't heard all the evidence. And I have both settled cases because he kind of let me know where it was going. And my client and I decided, well, the judge thinks we're not going to win, but we're going to, by golly, put on our case. More often than not, we lost our case, but sometimes he always listened very carefully and he would change his mind. But he was an excellent judge. He still works as a mediator, and I've used him as a mediator. And he, like I said, he's very smart, quick on the uptake, understands cases and the law. And again, I was sorry to see Judge Lineberger retire.
So now they require a lot of mediation, and was he kind of ahead of his time on the mediation thing?
Well, of course, the way he was mediating, it was using his authority and considerable impact on the case to kind of compel the parties to settle, whereas mediation is a much less forced process. That was just his judicial style, and it wasn't right or wrong, it was just his style. Judge Gibson, that was the Chancellor, Judge Lineberger, and Judge Gibson, I practiced before him and Judge Jameson, and Judge Gibson was very practical. He was quick on the uptake. He understood jury trials and juries and evidence and the presentation of a case, and he would keep things on track. And he was a very good judge in all respects. Again, I was sad when he retired. Judge Jameson had been a lawyer in private practice for many years before he got elected. Actually, Judge Cummings, I think, may have been on the bench when I got here, and Judge Gibson succeeded him within a year after I got here. And Judge Cummings was, there's a lot of funny stories about him. He would actually, in the middle of a trial, he had a phone at his desk, and he would take calls and make calls to his stockbroker and discuss stock trades in the middle of a trial. That was a little distracting, but that was Judge Cummings. He was a smart guy and a good judge, came out with good results, but he was, he had some idiosyncrasies. On another occasion, I think he was distracted with talking to his stockbroker on the phone, and during that time, the prosecutor lined up 8 or 10 people that had been brought up from the county jail to be arraigned and plead guilty or not guilty, and Judge Cummings knew that he had on his docket that same day some young lawyers that needed to be sworn into the bar that had passed the bar. So he finished his phone call and he said, all right, gentlemen, raise your hands. We're going to swear you in as new lawyers. Of course, standing before him were 8 or 10 convicts, not convicts, but accused from the county jail. And one of the lawyers said, Judge, you got the wrong group here. These people need to plead guilty or not guilty. The young lawyers are back there. You need to call them up if you're going to swear them in. So Judge Cummings was, there's some good stories about Judge Cummings.
Tell me about your dad's style as a judge. What was he like?
Well, I did not have any contested cases before him. I went several times growing up, from the time I was 7 or 8 years old through the time I was in law school, when I was be at home or whatever, and would watch him try cases just because that's what he did, and some of them were kind of interesting. And he was very, had a very good judicial demeanor. He was very unflappable. He communicated courteously with everybody in the courtroom. If anything out of hand happened, he would, you know, he was very controlled in everything. And I've heard from a lot of lawyers, you know, that they respected and admired him as a judge because he had very good manner in the courtroom. He explained all his rulings. He was very courteous to everybody. But I went to one case over there. I remember coming home from law school and went to see a case, and it was a commitment case where a lady was going to be committed to the state because the allegation was that she was mentally impaired. And the testimony was that she had been shooting with her .22 at school kids as they got off of the school bus near her rural home. and that she was threatening to kill everybody. And when the police went out there, she said that the Russians were about to take over the country, and the Martians had implanted a transmitter in her teeth so they knew where they were all the time, and electricity was running out of her sockets and going to kill her. And it was obvious that she had some mental problems. And so she got up on the stand to testify, and the lawyer was asking her questions, and all of a sudden, in the middle of it, she looked at my father and she said, "You know, you look just like my third husband, and he was the sexiest man I've ever known." And my father said, "Well, thank you for that comment. Please answer the question of counsel, and let's get on here." So I was just astonished that through all of her carrying on, he had just been level and even keeled. So at the end of the hearing, he committed her to the state custody for a mental examination. And we're walking out of the courtroom, and it's my dad, followed by the two lawyers, to go back to his chambers, I guess, to deal with who's going to draw the order or whatever, me behind them. And as we passed from the courtroom into his office, where nobody in the courtroom could hear her, my father turned around to the lawyers. He said, "Damn it," he said, "she was just nutty as a fruitcake, wasn't she?" So that kind of illustrates my father's demeanor on the bench, but that he was seeing what was going on, too. Everybody I ever talked to at the courthouse from the time I was 6 years old on say, "Oh, your daddy's Judge Butt. He's the finest man." I think he was very well liked by the courthouse staff. He kept one reporter, Ada Anderson, for 30 or 40 years, and his next reporter till he retired, so obviously his staff liked him. But I think he was well liked at the courthouse, but I probably wouldn't be the best person to know that or comment on it.
Now, one of the stories I've heard over the years is that in divorce cases, you have to prove. You have to prove cause.
You have to prove grounds or cause, yes.
And he was kind of what I've heard, he was kind of a stickler with expecting people to do that, whereas now it may not be required as much. Do you know when you? Is there any truth
to say
to
I
that?
know that my father was. He read the law, he understood the law, and he followed the law. And for years, the law in Arkansas said that a husband and wife could not get divorced unless the party petitioning for divorce could prove by the preponderance of the evidence that the marriage had become so intolerable that there was that general indignities have been rendered by one party to the other to make their life so intolerable that they cannot continue as married people. Many states, in the meantime, adopted no-fault laws that said if y'all want to get divorced, you can get divorced. You don't need proof. If you come into court and say we ain't getting along, we'll give you a divorce. But Arkansas did not do that. So some of the judges, kind of trending with the social thing, would require very light to almost no evidence of what these general indignities to render your life intolerable were. My father, I'm told, I never tried a contested case in front of him, strictly required that, and there had to be good evidence, and it had to be supported by corroboration that things were happening that made your life intolerable. You were being humiliated and embarrassed and emotionally or physically abused, and that your life, by a purely objective standard, was truly intolerable, not just that you were going through the normal fusses and frictions of a marriage and decided that divorce would be convenient. And that was his posture and interpretation of the law.
Tell me a little bit more about Jack Butt. You said that after law school you took another job and then eventually came back. Kind of walk me through how you got from law school to here, and then a little bit about your practice, your firm here.
I grew up in Fayetteville. It was a very Norman Rockwell growing up. I mean, we were kids with holes in our jeans, and we scuffled around and played, and we mowed lawns for money in the summer, and our parents had very little supervision or worry about us. We'd go out Saturday morning and not come home till Saturday night when we were 8 years old, and they didn't have any clue where we were. But now people in the neighborhood would certainly call our parents if they saw us getting into trouble or doing worrisome things. But as I said, I graduated from Fayetteville High School in 1968. I was lucky enough to get an ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps scholarship from the Army, and attended the University of Virginia for my undergraduate study, and graduated from there in 1972 with a degree in government and foreign affairs, essentially a political science degree. And because of that Army ROTC scholarship, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the regular Army, and I owed the Army 4 years of duty. This was in the middle of Vietnam. I volunteered for the infantry. They turned me down and assigned me to an administrative corps, and I figured if I wasn't going to be an Army guy carrying a gun doing Army things, that I would go on to law school. So they deferred me for law school, and I went to George Washington Law School in Washington, D.C. for 3 years. And during that time, I was in a status where during the summers, and if I had more than 3 days at a time off, I would go on active duty for on-the-job training as a lawyer. So I worked at Fort Belvoir and Fort Myer and Fort Pentagon, not Fort Pentagon, the Pentagon. Those are all military bases in and around Washington, D.C., and I would check in as a lieutenant or second lieutenant and basically work as a law clerk at the local Judge Advocate General office, the Army legal office there. And they would pay me for that, and I got good experience. I graduated in 1975 from George Washington Law School, and at that point I owed the Army 4 years, and I went on duty as a captain in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the Army Legal Corps, and I served some time in Germany and in Korea at the Pentagon, and my final duty station was a little post called Vent Hill Farm Station out about 60 miles from Washington, D.C. But I was on active duty for 4 years after law school, and at that point I had accomplished my service, and I converted to reserve status. And my wife and I had no children. We had all of our boxes punched. We had college degrees. We had experiences. I had gone back to law school on the night program while I was in the Army and gotten a master's in tax law. So I had 4 years experience as a lawyer in the Army. I had a law degree, a tax degree. My wife had an undergraduate degree, had worked while I was in the Army, so had a resume that she could get a job with. And we had no kids and no debts, and we took off for about a year and lived in a Volkswagen camper bus and traveled all over the United States, had the time of our lives. At the end of that time, we were kind of broke and didn't have any employment. We ended up back in the Washington, D.C. area, and I got a job with a general practice firm in Fairfax, Virginia, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., and practiced there doing general law, but with a focus on business and tax because I had my tax degree. And after a year and a half there, we had our first child, and we found that the Washington, D.C. area was too transient and busy and too much commuting to get to work and not like the places where we had grown up, and decided to move back to Fayetteville. And I applied to several places here. I've already told you I applied to Kim Smith, the prosecutor, for a job with his office. I applied to the firm which was then Crouch, Seipert, Blair, and Waters, an old line Springdale firm that still exists with a different name. They were in a period of transition because Frank Waters was going on the federal bench. Jim Blair was going in-house with Tyson at the time, and they weren't sure how things were going to end up. I applied with Kincaid, Horn, and Trumbo, a Fayetteville firm, was offered employment there, and applied at this firm and was offered employment here. So I looked at, and I actually was offered a job as a research and writing instructor at the University of Arkansas in the law school. I looked at all those and thought that this would be the best place to come, and came to work here in 1981, and I've been here for 38 years since then. In the Army, I did a lot of litigation. It was criminal litigation and courts-martial, but I was experienced and comfortable, and I think pretty good in the courtroom. And I only got my tax degree kind of after that. And so most tax and business lawyers don't spend much time in the courtroom, and most courtroom lawyers don't spend any time worrying about taxes and business deals. But I kind of had these two different things, and my whole career I've been able to mix them together, where I do a lot of business law, but when my clients get into trouble with a contract or something, I'm comfortable litigating it if I want to. But that's been my practice since I've been here. I do a lot of estate planning, setting up and managing small businesses, business contracts. If it deals with papers and dollars and cents, I do it. I have a lot of clients that are medium to medium large businesses, and they need help with their employees or buying a new building or doing their contracts, and I help them with that and do their tax planning, buy and sell small businesses. So that's what my career has been here. Though I've tried a little bit of everything. I mean, I've had DWIs in municipal court, and I tried one workers' compensation case and decided that was all I ever wanted to do, and so on.
Let me ask you this. If someone came to you, say somebody from another area, and said, tell me about Washington County. What's Washington County like? What would you tell them?
Well, that's difficult. I'm prejudiced. I was gone for 13 years in undergraduate, law school, the Army, a year that we took off, and I literally interviewed with 8 or 9 law firms all over the United States while we were traveling around our Volkswagen bus. And I've practiced law in Virginia and literally all over the world as a JAG lawyer. And my choice was to move back here. I think Washington County is a great place. I think it's beautiful. I think the towns are nice and well run. We've enjoyed the bounty of Walmart and Tyson's and J.B. Hunt. So when I was growing up, this was not a wealthy area, and it's become fairly wealthy in parts. But it's got some beautiful rural parts that I enjoy because I'm an outdoors person. I like to hunt and fish and camp, and I am in the woods a lot in Washington County. And at the same time, it's got some very sophisticated urban parts. The Crystal Bridges Museum, the entertainment districts on Dixon Street and now in Rogers, the university and what it brings. You've got big-time college athletics, so it's a very sophisticated, cosmopolitan choice of things to do and see and experience, while at the same time, I can leave my office and in 25 minutes I'm where I can't hear or see a car, and all I can see around me are mountains and trees and clouds and streams, and that's perfect for me. I guess my favorite thing about Washington County is, as I've said before, the diversity here between the cosmopolitan, sophisticated, urban, and the very rural. And when you get out in the rural and woods parts, you still run into some of the old mountain folk in their overalls, and they milk cows by hand, and they may have a sheep or two they shear, and they gather their eggs. They're fewer and fewer all the time. We were talking about the Cane Hill people. But, Washington County still has, to the extent it doesn't have the actual people, they have lots of memories to me of the old hill folk and small farmers that lived out there, and that's juxtaposed with Crystal Bridges Museum and a University of Arkansas football game with 70,000 people, and I find all those things to be very, invigorating or interesting as a place to live.